This is the Empower Podcast, released September 20th, 2020. Episode 509. Cellular IoT with Jared Wolff. Welcome to the Amp Hour. I'm Chris Gamble of Contextual Electronics.
And I'm Jared Wolff, Circuit Dojo.
Hey, Jared, how you doing?
I'm doing all right, Chris. How you doing?
Well, I sound a little stuffy. I had a nose surgery yesterday, so I apologize to everyone out there. I will sound a little stuffy through this, but I did not want to give up a chance to talk with Jared because he's doing some cool things with cellular and sensors. And how did you get into all this?
Man, I've been doing this for a while now. Much like you, I went to a school that does a lot of kind of hands-on. I did a co-op program, so there's a lot more hands-on stuff going on.
Oh, right, RIT, of course. Yeah, that's up the street from me. I lived in Buffalo, so yeah, that was on my list.
Oh, okay, there you go. Just very much so like what you guys talked about on the show previously. I never really learned a lot of like the hands-on stuff. I actually just had to do it on my own, and that's how I learned most of the things I do. It's like all the theory and things I learned in college sort of useful, and like some of the things were interesting at the end. It's like most of the stuff I learned on my own, SparkFun, Adafruit, very early days.
Great, yeah. And then, so you said you actually did like a couple co-ops as well.
Yeah, so I was really fortunate. Just really good timing. I ended up working for, it was actually right like 2007, 2008. So right when everything went sour, I worked for Cisco and then I worked for Apple. I had some other stuff going on too.
Oh, that's great. That's really great. So tell me about some of this company. I mean, these are not small companies, not small names. What were the work environments like?
So the co-op system at Cisco is interesting. We're basically kind of glorified labor to some extent. And like I learned a lot, and I was close with the engineers, and they were able to teach us stuff and things like that. But I worked in the cable group, so our focus was all on DOCSIS 3 modems at the time, except it was not the modems, but actually the hardware that sits in the rack at Comcast that communicates with your modem at home. A bit, there being some repeaters and stuff in the middle. And that technology at the time was just coming out where it's like faster cable modems. And we had to take these giant line cards and basically shuttle them between either other engineers. We had to bring them to the rework technicians. We're all kind of in the same room except for the software engineers and the other engineers. So we were responsible for basically shuffling and moving these, $50,000 line cards around. It was actually the first time. It was really cool to see. I was like, how does this guy do this? And I don't know if it's a weird trend in Silicon Valley, but all the rework technicians are Vietnamese in Silicon Valley for whatever reason. At least the ones I worked with. I know there were some other ones, but the ones that were just brilliant and really good were all Vietnamese. I don't know why, but it was just awesome to watch them because they could just do crazy stuff. I was describing this to somebody else the other day. They would take these chips and then they would run magnet wire to one of the leads or one of the balls underneath these parts, lay down the magnet wire, and then put the part back, and it would work.
Like what gauge are we talking about here? Like 40 gauge?
We're talking about teeny tiny. I don't know exactly what the gauge was, but it was it was super tiny. That actually was that particular instance was actually at Apple. The woman who was there, she was just brilliant. I don't know how she would just do stuff. She's just like, what? You just replaced all of this? You just ran this wire underneath this crazy flash part? Like, all right, cool.
Yeah, that's great. And then Apple as well. Yeah, so that's another different culture, I guess. But so both Silicon Valley though. So did you make that conscious choice to jump out of Silicon Valley from Rochester or what?
It was just a good opportunity to learn. I'm kind of an East Coast guy at heart. I'm back in the East Coast. So I lived out there for 7-8 years in kind of total. It was an interesting experience, mostly because you're working at this giant company. And it was very exciting as an intern, but I see how soul-sucking it could be if you actually work there full time. Because you're like, as an intern, you're like, I want to work, I want to travel, I want to go, I want to do. And then you do that as a full-time job and you have a life outside of work. It's just like, how do you do this?
Right. Yeah, it's definitely like because of the long hours and the flights to China, I'm sure, right? It's just
Yeah,
it's the
it was
lifestyle.
brutal. And one of my kind of mentors from Apple, he ended up working at Nest, one of the first engineers at Nest. He's got a lot of issues now, like health issues now that he's taking all these flights back and forth to China, kind of burning the candle at both ends,
Oh yeah. Yep.
kind of paying for it. And a lot of these, like another one of the engineers I know I worked with, he was another mentor. He just like flipped out. He after the last startup he worked for, he just like screw it, and he just kind of went off the rails and just like kind of did his own thing. It's like
Like no
whoa,
more tech kind of thing.
no more tech,
Yeah.
no
Yeah,
more tech.
that's unfortunate too because I've met some people like that as well that have burned out on tech and it's just like and they're brilliant minds and it's just yeah it's just the lifestyle. It's nothing against them. It's just they really it's such a sour experience that you wouldn't want to be there anymore if you think that you might be able to find a smaller company that maybe has better culture, but you might have the lifestyle built up around the higher salaries of Silicon Valley or just the bleeding edge tech, and it's like, well, I don't want to go work for some like Midwest industrial company that's putting down through whole parts of their boards. It's just kind of it's a tight spot, I'm sure, and I'm sure just about anything looks better than that.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people kill work for these companies, but there's also the other edge of the sword, and the culture has changed a lot. I mean, I worked there when Steve Jobs was still alive,
Got it.
so
Yeah.
people would he would be sitting outside of Johnny, and people would walk by, and some people we didn't. I was just like, "What are you doing?" People just stand there and gawk at him, and they're just like across the way at Cafe
Yeah.
Max,
Yeah.
and like it was just like a normal thing. Like people would just stop and watch, and I'm like,
That's weird.
ah, it's
Yeah.
super weird, guys.
Yeah.
That's
Like
just like one level lower,
that's not even hero worship. That's just like idolatry almost.
I guess. And I mean, it's just one level lower of going up to them. And man, I don't know any stories. I've heard of people trying to go up to them, and I don't think it ended very well.
Well, yeah.
But
Yeah, that's a weird culture, but it's so then you moved outside of it. So that's good. Let's move on to the next thing. What were you doing after Apple?
so after that, I went back to school, finished my co-op requirements, and I finished the rest of my schooling. It was like another year. And then I came back out to California and worked at some startups in San Francisco. And that's where I got my first kind of introduction to Nordic and their Bluetooth chips. And at the time,
Oh
they
yeah.
were kind of integrating their NRF 8001, which was their kind of intro to, or their, it didn't have a processor in it yet.
Oh,
So
okay. Just the transceiver.
we were just the transceiver over SPI, I think, and we were integrating that, and then they were coming out with the M0, the NRF 51. We were all kind of excited about it. We were like, we don't know if it's going to work for us in this case. Only at the timing was different. We could have used one of the more like recent models, like the NRF 52.
Yeah.
But that's where I kind of started cutting my teeth with Bluetooth and Nordic chips. I really enjoyed using them, so it was kind of love at first sight, I guess.
That's great. Yeah, continues to this day. Now you're making stuff that we'll talk about here in a second.
Yep.
Great. Any other lessons from the startup side of things? And we've had people from different startups, but it seems like the ones that you were at were maybe a little more consumer driven as well, like consumer facing rather.
Yeah, most of the ones I worked for are all consumer facing, except for more recently I was doing some IoT work where this kind of rich guy thought it was kind of cool to start up a company and make stuff even though there's no market for it. But I digress. Working for startups was interesting because you get to learn a lot, and if you thrive on doing a lot of different things and not being good at particular one thing, then those startups are good.
Uh-huh.
You'll learn a lot. I like kind of more of the breadth than the depth. Like if you start asking me crazy RF questions, I have no idea. If you start asking me like even kind of like more in depth like calculations or anything like that, it's like hold on, let me use the internet.
Yes.
So I'm by no
Sounds familiar.
means
I think we're kindred spirits in this way. Yeah.
yeah. Like I hate technical interviews mostly
Oh
because
yeah.
they're expecting you to just be like, what are all the things you learned from college that you haven't used, and
Yeah.
tell me
Right.
now.
Tell
Like,
me about your
oh,
third integrals or triple integrals rather. It's
right,
like,
yeah, not that
what if I
bad,
tell you
but
about things I actually use? Like.
right, right. So, yeah, it's fast paced, but it's just as stressful as working at a big job. It's just
Yeah.
there's different requirements on you, and I found myself, especially if we're going for a big build, I found myself going to the leadership and being like, guys, we have long lead time parts, 14 weeks, gotta order it now. And I was just like, come on, come on. I'm like doing the job of like a supply chain person, the test person, like creating all these test fixtures, everything from scratch. And I'm like the only person doing this. It's like, what is this?
Yeah. It's like you're the reality bringer, like you have to be like, no, no, it's really gonna bite us if we don't order the parts at the beginning, like that. I've had that role as well, where it's like it just doesn't click because there's not that immediacy of it. Because startups are so reactionary normally of like, oh, customer A is angry, customer B is what it wants to pay less, whatever. It's like it's hard to plan that far out in the future when you don't even have the cash flow to do that sort of thing. It's just like that's the downside to hardware startups in general, is that they're not built for the software model is so like cash light and hardware is so cash heavy.
Yeah. So that was an interesting learning experience for me. And I was like, I was always the one bringing the bad news, so uh, everybody thought I was difficult. I'm like, just like this is the reality. Like we have to ship, but we need to get all the parts and the batteries and the pieces and the to make it work. Like you can't
Right.
ship half finished product.
Right. This isn't an app, folks. We can't do an update over the air.
No OTAs with your plastics yet.
That's right. Yeah. Well, yeah. The hidden promise of 3D printers that will probably never come to fruition. Uh, so did that make you kind of burn out? I mean, we've talked about burnout a little bit, but like, did that make you burn out of startups? What made you go out on your own then?
Yeah, so I totally burned out. So end of June 2016, after basically carrying the project I was working on for a while, I just said I saw the writing on the wall in terms of the company. It was kind of sad because they took a lot of money from people. It was like, what? Oh, but I just had to say, all right, well, see you guys later. So I ended up moving out of my apartment in San Francisco, and I got on my motorcycle and I rode it for let's see, 3 4 months
Oh,
around the
wow.
West
Okay.
Coast. So I
Yeah. You just
went.
did like the Highway 1 kind of thing, PCH.
Yeah, I've done parts of it before, and there were parts of it I didn't do, so I didn't do the rest of those parts that I didn't do. But I also ended up going up through into Oregon, like Crater Lake,
Oh,
Washington,
yeah.
all the way up into
Uh-huh.
Vancouver.
Uh-huh.
I had ridden through BC and Yukon Territory before. I went with a buddy a couple of years before, and that was really beautiful. But and then I went all the way down to San Diego, LA area, and just
Uh-huh.
like back and forth. And I ended up getting sick in the middle of it from some crazy fungus that grows in the dirt, like halfway between
Oh,
San
wow.
Francisco and LA. Yeah, that was a surprise,
Yeah.
and nobody knew what it was. So I ended up having to fly. I was in Colorado. I ended up to fly back to San Jose because I had California insurance at the
Oh, my.
time, and
Right.
they thought I had tuberculosis. So
And that's like 6 cases a year these, right? I mean, it's like very rare these days, but like, yeah,
yeah,
it still does happen.
they forced me to stay in the hospital, and then I was just like on the internet like the second day. I'm like, this is stupid. Like I don't have tuberculosis. And I looked it up. I'm like, oh, it's valley fever. Like I have all the symptoms. I was in a place where about 30 other workers had just gotten it because they were installing solar panels. Like I had literally ridden next to the solar panels on my way out of there. So I was like, valley fever. So
What do you call it? Valley fever? Like,
valley fever.
okay.
I think it starts with some, that's the short version of it. I
Okay.
think there's something before the valley.
Huh.
I don't think it's
Wow.
Death Valley.
So when you said you were gonna like pack up all your stuff and move out of your apartment, I thought you were gonna say you moved back east, but like, I say riding a motorcycle for 4 months is like that's a true burnout move. I mean, like that's like you were really burnt out. Like, yeah,
I was super burned out.
yeah.
And then after that, I left my motorcycle in California, and then I went to Taiwan. So
Oh, wow. Okay.
yeah, in
For how long?
Taiwan. Man, it was three. It was for at first 3 months, and then I ended up staying there another. The first time it was 2 months, and then I stayed another three. So I
Wow.
was just like, oh, I like it here.
Yeah. Yeah. I've not been, but I have a friend from there and he loves it. Yeah, it's very densely packed area, right? Just because of the
Yep, depends on where you
geography
are.
of yeah,
If you're in Taipei, it's pretty dense. Or
yeah.
outside, New Taipei City is all very dense.
And is this where you started Circuit Dojo? Is remote, like doing remote work then, or what?
So I ended up not doing any work. fortunately, I had saved up some money so I could kind of do this. I mean, one of the things I did very early on, which really sucked, was I had paid off all my school loans. I had like, I don't know, probably $50,000 in school debt, 40,000 around there. After I graduated, RIT
Uh-huh.
is not a cheap school, as you know.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah.
So I just said, "Oh, all right, I just got to pay this off," and it has paid dividends since then. Because
Yeah.
I'd be probably still be paying it right now if I was just doing the minimum payments every month.
Uh-huh. Yep.
But
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we've talked about healthcare now and spending in U.S. universities, and yeah, people outside the U.S. It's like, yeah, this is some of the restrictions. Honestly, some of the restrictions on starting your own business or going on your own is like, yeah, you need health insurance in the states. You need to pay off student loans if you're, depending on what your financial situation was in college. Like, it's tough. I mean, I think the reason I didn't end up going to RIT is because it was going to be more expensive than Case Western was. So,
mm,
yeah, like Case always just gave away a lot of money, and I was like, yeah, I have to go there, and I'm glad I did, but I think it was between those two schools.
yeah,
So
I almost went to. I think I applied and almost I got in the case, and I was just like, oh, okay. I, you kind of touched on this when I listened to the previous episode, and you're like, I kind of got lucky. It's like same here.
yeah, like choosing electronics as like a long term kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, well, originally I was going to try to get into mechanical engineering, and they're just like, sorry, nope, full.
Oh
And
wow.
here's your other option. And I was like,
Yeah.
computer engineering. Okay, I like computers.
Yeah. Well, if people don't know too, I mean, RIT has this amazing like they have a fab in house there that was actually one of the big things they pushed for when I was getting like looking around there is they talked about how you could work in the fab, and it was one of the bigger ones on the East Coast at least.
Yeah, it's cool to walk by because we're all shared in the same shared building, so you could walk by on the way to class, and people would be in their bunny suits and be holding up a wafer,
Yep. Yep.
and it's like, oh, this is kind of cool. Or
Yeah.
they have a statue of it's not really a statue; it's actually a big piece of silicon in like a case. So like this is the silicon that's cut
Oh,
into
like an ingot
wafers.
or something? Like
Yeah, it was an ingot. Yep.
yeah, nice.
It's like what? And it's like it's changed so much since I've been there, and it's like there's just more buildings and more stuff. It's like what? They have a
Yeah.
whole right down the hall. They have a whole manufacturing lab, which I'm actually more interested in. So they have CNC machines, lathes, like everything you can think of, and it's just like right there, and it's
Uh-huh.
a big glass box, so you can just like look in and see what's going on.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, Northwestern has that here up in Chicago too. They have like a big innovation space, and it's like there's like the top floor. You can kind of look down into it and watch the fellow nerds at work. It's great. That's
Ah,
cool.
yes.
So then you started developing. So when you say so Circuit Dojo is consulting for others or just building your own stuff? I mean, when did that actually start to kick in? When and how did the burnout go away? Because yeah, I've definitely felt burnout, but maybe not as long of a time. It sounds like there was a bit of a recovery for you.
Yeah. So when I came back to, so I left Taiwan, and then someone had hit me up, a previous mentor from Apple, and he was saying, "Oh, hey, we have this project. This is the IoT one, and we're doing this thing." I'm like, "Oh, okay, all right, we'll do it." And I ended up working for them for a little bit, and then it was like a year later, and then the owner was just like, "Me, I don't feel like paying any more money. You guys are done." And we're like, oh, "Okay, cool." So
Oh
at that
my.
point, yeah.
Yeah, that's not fun. I mean,
what like advice for anybody is like have at least 3 to 5 months of expenses and savings.
yeah,
When working at a startup, because
yeah,
people will paint it in the most beautiful picture, and then you
yeah.
start working there, and it's just like surprise you're laid off, or surprise we're paying you minimum wage because we haven't got around to funding yet.
Oh wow.
So
Yeah, I feel like I was when I went to go join a startup, I was advised many times to like ask about their cash flow situation, ask about like what's their runway and all this other stuff. And the funny thing is like even if you have a company that has like a 2 year runway, they don't want to use it. Like it's not like they're like,
no,
well, go down to zero. It's like, no, no, no.
no,
If we get to 1 year, there's a big chop coming, and if we get to six
yep,
months, there's another big chop coming because we got to
yep.
stretch it out. Then it's like that's what I didn't quite grasp. It was just like cash by itself is not a good indicator of how fast it will be spent again.
No, you kind of you have to look at their runway and how they're spending it and what their plan is. Because
Yeah,
I've worked for
yeah.
companies where like, we're gonna ramp up, and then they ramped up and they ran out of money.
Right, right. Because then you get ramp up and you need cash to go build all the things that you don't have it, and it's like, oh, okay.
Right.
Yeah, it's almost like what are the key turning points? It's like, if we don't ship by, June 1st, then what happens? That's like almost a better question to ask than how much runway do you have. It's like, how much revenue do we need to have in order for you to keep everybody around? Because I get it from like from a business perspective, they want to survive, but it's from a, from as an employee, it's like, I don't want to be, I don't care how many ping pong tables you have, or how great the kombucha is. It's how much job stability do I have, and and what can I do with that, or what should I be planning for otherwise?
Yep, that's the problem. It's like if you're looking for job security, go work for Apple. If you're looking for experience and things you'll never see anywhere else, work for a startup.
Yeah. Yep. Right. Right. Yeah. If you never thought you'd be packing and shipping at 2 in the morning, and
Oh,
running,
I've done that.
driving somewhere. Yeah. Yeah.
We went
Like it's.
we had to do fulfillment for a full order of thousands of units. We
Oh
were at the
wow.
factory
Uh huh.
alongside the people at the factory doing all the
Yep.
work
Yep.
because we didn't have any money.
Yeah. Your time is bought and paid for by salary dollars, huh?
Huh.
Yeah. Wow. And so when you were doing all this manufacturing too, was that all overseas, or were you doing it domestic?
So I've done a mix of domestic. The company, the one I really burned out at, is the one I just mentioned, where we're doing assembly. We did do the kind of the first manufacturing run actually in California, and then we ended up bringing it overseas to China. Uh, Not surprised, surprise, surprise. And then we kind of started bringing up our factory there, and that's when I said, "See you guys later." Like everything's up and running. Bye.
Yep. Yep. Yeah.
Um, and then that's kind of been the theme of China in kind of my relationship with engineering in the past kind of 10 years. When I first started, they're like, yeah, we're going to go to China. Like, this is just like a thing. Like, someone somewhere said, China's a really good idea.
Yep. It's in the NBA playbook. That's what I always say.
It is like, no one questioned it. I was like, when someone told me that I had to protect our source code and like do all these things to make sure they don't steal it, I'm like, why are we going there even in the first place?
Right.
Like,
Yep.
question mark. Hey guys, I mean, now that I'm what 10 years, 13, 14 years later, is like, oh, hey, I actually have a choice about this. So most of the stuff I do these days it's local. So my manufacturer, my CM that does all the board assembly for Circuit Dojo is down the street.
Oh wow.
Besides
Great.
myself,
Uh huh.
which is really cool. Like I didn't realize there's so many board houses in this area.
Uh huh.
There's within the driving distance of like 10, 15, 20 minutes, there's like 3 or 4.
Yeah. Yeah. Usually, I find that it's if you have a behemoth former company nearby, that usually helps to sprout up a lot of like supporting companies. So like, I still benefit from a lot of companies that were here to serve Motorola back in the day in the 90s and 2000s. And so a lot of the individual companies, they may have pivoted to medical or military, or whatever they could do to survive, but a lot of them are still around. And I don't know if there was like a big company there that was it. There's a GE facility near you, right, or something like that.
We have a lot of military here, so
Oh, okay.
there's Pratt and Whitney, which is
Uh huh.
more up north. Yeah, there's just like there's like 3 or 4 different like government contractor type companies in
Uh
Connecticut
huh.
that you'd never think they were here.
Uh huh. Yep. Oh, that's cool. That's cool. And yeah, I mean, is there much of a scene otherwise? Can you like go and meet people that are designing electronics, or is it more than just on the manufacturing side?
There are some cool maker spaces. They're growing, so there's more coming out, and some are closing, some are growing. Right now, it's really tough because of COVID. I actually had to like it was really tough for me at one point. So I was like, sorry guys, like I wanted to help because it's like these places need to stay open. Like these are really important. Like
Yeah.
all these hacker spaces are just super important because that's the only way people know how to make stuff these days.
Yep.
Like nobody knows how to make stuff anymore. Like how do you cut a piece of wood in half? How do I change my car tire? Like what?
Yep. Yeah. I didn't know they're doing that in makerspaces, but maybe they're cutting wood in half. But
They're cutting wood. I'm just saying,
yeah.
like being handy in general.
Yeah. Right. Right.
Like you ask that to somebody in San Francisco or San Francisco Bay Area in general, and they just go, "Huh? I don't know
Huh.
how to do that. I just call AAA. Are you kidding me?"
Yeah. Yeah. Huh. So how has it been? So you said you're working with a domestic manufacturer. have you done like cost benefit comparisons against going overseas, or just kind of handing it off?
So do some kind of initial quotes with a manufacturer I had visited in Taiwan, and it wasn't too far off. It was
Oh, great.
only like a few dollars. Like honestly, it wasn't that big of a deal. And I'm not some big kind of faceless corporation that needs to get every cent. So I was like, why do
Yeah,
it?
yeah, that's great.
So it's like support local. Why not? And
Yeah, I
then
think even being able to just drive there if there's a problem, it's just like, all right, I'll be there in an hour
oh,
or
that's been
whatever it is.
huge.
You know?
We
Yeah.
had I sent out an email to my backers the other day. We had an assembly issue at the beginning, and I always try to do this where we'll populate one panel and then just kind of make sure it's all good. And we found that some of the LEDs were upside down,
Oh, yep.
and some and the buck boost, it was totally rotated 180 degrees. So it's just like that happens every single time.
Yep.
Is like without fail. So we were able to catch it early, and that's the best when you can do that, and then you can run the rest of the boards, and there's not much of a problem except for maybe some potential assembly issues here and there.
Yeah, tombstoning or yeah, just like weird flow of solder paste or something weird.
Yeah.
All right, so we should take a break real quick here and say what are you building? I guess we haven't said that yet. Sorry about that.
Oh, that's okay. So right now, I am focusing on building the NRF 9160 Feather. It's a cellular module, so a Nordic cellular module, NRF 91, and it's got a processor in it, also with a low power radio for cellular, so Cat M1 and NB-IoT.
And GPS.
And GPS. Good.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I had first heard about that when I was working at a pest company, and I was super excited about it. But that was like 2 or 3 years. It was 3 years ago now, and it was a very slow ramp from Nordic. And I was surprised when I started following your posts. I was surprised that it seems like they've definitely worked a lot of the Kingstop. But what is the status of that part right now? The 9160.
Man, so I had mentioned this a while back, and you might have seen this, is they've been talking about this part for probably 4 or 5 years now. And it was like very secretive, and I remember seeing
Yeah.
pictures of it in like a Pelican case, and it's like, here it is, it's secret. Oh man. And I just talked to Jonathan Barry yesterday
Oh, you did. Oh,
because
great.
he was interested in using the NRF 91, and he was just like, the biggest thing that I've seen is just like it's the networks. It's the networks that's the issue.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
getting all the certifications, and I'm painfully learning that right now. It's like how terribly streamlined it is to even get a pre-certified module where you can use their network. It's
Yeah.
just like mind-blowingly difficult, and like you
Yeah.
have to be a Linux system administrator to actually get those tests to work. It's like what?
Yeah. Yeah, so let's talk about that a little. So this is part of my past life. I was at Hologram, and I introduced you to those guys as well. And so yeah, you have to have a sim. But tell us about like what is it like to get a piece of silicon, and all of there's support circuitry obviously on your board. And there's also support circuitry even within the 9160 module. But what does it take to get that onto a network and like talking to towers?
So the NRF 91 has a whole, it's ginormous, a specific modem firmware. So I believe they're using one core to just run the modem firmware, and the other core is running your application firmware. I could be wrong here.
That sounds familiar. Yeah, from the promo stuff I saw. Yeah, yeah,
Whenever I try to update the modem firmware, it actually takes like a good 40 seconds to a
oh
minute
wow,
to
okay,
load
yeah,
it. So it's huge.
yeah,
And so what's happening is very much so like how you're describing kind of how the Quectel modules work. You're issuing commands to that modem firmware. That modem firmware is doing some magic in there to kind of manipulate the hardware lower levels to communicate with the cell towers, and that's that's how it's working. So they abstract all of the kind of complex AT commands and network stuff in Zephyr in the software itself. So you're not actually having to issue those commands yourself unless you want to.
right, yeah. So if you wanted to do the certification though, you'd have to be doing AT commands. Is that right?
The certification process, it would benefit you to know the AT commands, but for the most part, you're actually just using pre configured software actually part of Nordic's SDK. They have a few examples that you're mainly using for the certification process.
Got it. Okay. And so, what certifications are you going for?
So, in terms of compliance, I just want to make sure the board is compliant. I'm not really particularly worried, but FCC NICEAD, which is Canada, they, I don't know, recently renamed it from Industry Canada to ICED. And also CE, so making sure that there's no EMI issues with the board in any of those regions. Those are my kind of biggest concerns. So
Got it.
compliance, and then also I'm working with Verizon to get the board okayed as a socket modem. So anybody, it's kind of like a socket modem. This is where things get hairy. It's like now that you have a processor along with the radio chip, it
Uh,
all of a sudden becomes a standalone thing. But you need to have some certain support for lightweight M2M for firmware over the air updates, things like that, and it starts getting hairy. And also starts getting hairy when you want to use this device on their network because you have to run a certain version of Nordic's SDK to make sure you're compliant with Verizon, for example.
got it. Yeah. Right.
So there's a lot of boxes.
So the certification with Verizon, the certification with AT&T. There's PTC RB. Are you doing that one as well?
So recently, AT&T just came. They just finished AT&T cert. I don't know if they've published that day, but it is
Oh.
done. And then I don't know if there's anything. There's no other domestic U.S. carriers at the moment that you can get certified with.
Uh huh. But are you doing PTC RB as well?
I'm not doing any PTC RB.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, it's just it's really crazy too because I've talked to clients who wanted to do cellular in the past, and I worked on a hologram, and people wanted to, certify their hardware, and it's just like you just keep like, oh, I have to do this now. Like I didn't even know about it. Like there's nowhere that's just like here's all the things you have to do to get a modem certified on all these different networks, talking to all the towers, getting the right updates, and it's just like it really is much more of a hodgepodge than I would have guessed. And our phones are so seamlessly handing off, but well, if depending on your carrier and stuff like that, but like even roaming and stuff like that, it feels like it's so seamless, and yet it's such like fiefdoms. Like there's a Verizon fiefdom, the AT&T, the Sprint. What's the other one? We just bought Sprint.
T-Mobile.
T-Mobile. That's it. Yep. And I mean, it's just like it's crazy that they. And then you think about overseas as well, and it's just there's so many different towers and operators you need to talk to. It's really quite a mess.
Yeah, there's no such thing as a universal service or I mean, they do have quote unquote universal SIM cards where you can bring it. And that's where like hologram comes in. They're awesome. You can go pretty much take your hologram based LTE device anywhere as long as they have kind of 4G Cat M1 or and even NB-IoT. That's kind of the advantage there. But yeah, without a company like Hologram, you're kind of out of luck, and you have to go to every single vendor and be like, "Hey, I want to use your network," and you have to get set up and get a particular SIM card for their network, and it's just a mess.
So yeah, it's just like such a tough thing where even Verizon or even hologram rather, you're roaming with data there. You're not even using full speed, full capabilities that you might be with a Verizon, just because they wouldn't let you on their network to crank data like that. Really, I mean, you'd have to have specified cards and
Yeah.
things like that. So yeah, it's kind of crazy that it's. I guess the other thing that's crazy to me is that like they call them pre-certified modules, but like they are pre-certified, but it's still you still have to do all these other steps.
Yeah, and that's the sucky part. Is just you need to get your product in certified, and then there's also whisperings of an end software certification,
Uh
which
huh.
kind of totally defeats the purpose of having a module or anything. It's like, why even?
Yeah.
Why?
Right.
So those are extra hoops.
Yeah, I feel like I mean I get the reason that they do it. Like they don't want spurious traffic or something that's just like spewing bad packets on their network. But like, yeah, if it's pre-certified, that means that the hardware should be taking care of that, not the software. Like I shouldn't be able to access any modes in the modem that allow me to spew stuff on the wrong frequency or send bad data or continuously send bad data. Like that should be at the module level in my opinion.
Definitely, I agree with that. And the only other thing I could say is that from what the Verizon engineers kind of alluded to is, for instance, like firmware over the air is like part of the process. Like you have to have that capability, and if your device doesn't have it, that's where it's just like you're kind of screwed. If like the network operators update their firmware and their towers, and all of a sudden your device can't talk to them, they have to have that kind of emergency switch where they can go in there and they can update your device, so at least it can talk to the towers. So
Yeah.
that's just like one extra thing.
When you say that firmware, you mean the modem firmware versus like your application firmware?
Well, that's where it gets sticky in the NRF Connect SDK, is that the firmware over the air stuff is actually on the application side.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So you have to add that into your application code for that particular part of the code to work and for you to be kind of Verizon compliant. And then all the modem firmware stuff, that doesn't really change. And eventually they are, I know Nordic is in the process of making it so you can do kind of firmware over the air for the modem firmware, but that's kind of still in the process because, as I mentioned, it's huge. We're talking about, I don't know how big it is, but it's got to be in the upper hundreds of kilobytes, if not
Oh
one
wow.
megabyte.
Yeah. And like what is that percentage wise? Like what how much memory is on board that chip, the module rather?
So it has 1 meg of application space. So I don't know if that, I don't think it's split. I think that's just what's available to you. There's a lot of functionality in the NF91 that's still not documented or shared. I'm curious if it has another 5 for like a Bluetooth. I'm just like, because there's a lot of pins on it. There's a lot of pins on it that aren't used.
Right. I think they are well. So the 91 thingy I found out does have a Bluetooth chip on it because I was talking to someone and showing them my new board. And I was like, "Oh, look at this! It has Bluetooth and cellular." And he pulls out his 91 thingy, which is like the little square dev board that they sell for people who haven't seen it before. And it's like, "Oh no, that has one on there too. It's definitely already a thing." So it's not like anything was original from my side of things, but it's definitely on the. That's definitely what Nordic wants to be doing is saying, "Hey, cellular and Bluetooth together is a good combo." So hopefully it
Yeah.
will show up on that singular modem.
I hope so, and that's what I was originally hoping that they would do. When I first heard about the cellular, I'm like, wow, this is awesome. They're gonna get a Bluetooth chip plus a cellular chip in the same module. And then like 2 years later, I was like, oh, they don't have Bluetooth. So I think that's probably
Right.
the next step. That's the logical next step, right?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, well, the crazy thing too is that like internal these chips, like they're all SDRs internally, you know. But I think it's more of the muxing and the antenna capabilities you need to have on the outset. You'd the I don't think the cell modem, sorry, the cell antennas that are recommended are either wideband, but I don't know if they're tuned enough for 2.4 to be useful because usually the cell modems are what like 1900 megahertz for the high end of GSM at least. So
You'd be surprised. Some of these antennas that I was looking at, I was evaluating for the NRF91 Feather. Some of them actually are tuned pretty well for all of the bands for cellular, including 2.4 gigahertz. So technically, even including GPS, if you get the right one, and it's like, whoa, like all I have to do is plug in one antenna. This is
yeah, that's
awesome.
pretty nutty. Yeah, yeah. You see like the peaks on the S11 chart, or sorry, the dips in the
Yep,
S11 chart, and it's like
exactly.
that's a lot of dips. Like if someone did a lot of simulation on these, and it must be a small antenna for yours, right? Because the feather form factor is not large.
So I am using external ones. There's no space
Oh, okay.
for a chip down antenna. That would have been crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah, just using an external, that gives people the flexibility if they want to use a different antenna completely. Maybe they have like a rubber ducky style, or
Uh
maybe
huh.
they
Yep.
want to do a UFL to SMA and then hook up that way, as long as it's within the limits of FCC, obviously.
Yep. Do you have like a recommended one that did you sell one with a kit or did you just kind of say, here's where you might want to get one, or how did you do that for your crowdfunding backers?
Yeah, so the ones I have for my crowdfunding backers, it's included. So every package comes with a antenna, which is like a flex antenna that has some 3M tape, double-sided tape on the back, so you can kind of stick it to things if you want. It comes with the NRF91 feather. It comes with some headers you can solder on if you want, and it also comes with a hologram SIM card.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. So just to go back for a second, I don't know if we've ever talked about it on the show before. Could you explain the differences between Cat M1 and BIoT and Cat One or the other cats that are out there?
Man, there's so many cats.
It's a bag of cats. Yes.
So many, oh, just a bag of cats. So Cat 4, as you go down, so you start like Cat 4, your phones, I don't even know what the phones have. Cat
I
5,
think they're Cat 6 now. Yeah.
Cat 6. So
Yeah.
the higher category, the faster speed you have. So
Yeah.
the lower you go, so you're going down. So this modem is capable of Cat M1 and NB-IoT. Cat M1 is like the slowest you can go on a traditional LTE signal. So what they're doing is as you go from the top to the bottom in terms of fast, slow, they're changing the how much bandwidth you're using, so they're just squeezing the band slower and smaller and smaller and smaller. For NB-IoT, it's kind of a different beast because uh, I believe they use some different modulation techniques, but it's also much more narrow and it's actually
Yeah.
even less data you can get through.
Yeah, I thought they were just using like sidebands for NB-IoT or something that's
Yeah,
very non-traditional. It was like 200 kilohertz, and it's like just the sideband or something weird in there, but I don't remember what it was specifically.
yeah, it's something crazy like that. And usually they need separate equipment. So that's a big difference between Cat M1 is that they were able to roll out Cat M1 in the US faster because they all they had to do was update their existing infrastructure with
Yeah.
just some firmware updates. Whereas with NB-IoT, it actually requires some more capital investment to actually get people to install those things for it to work. So that's why you don't see a lot of Cat or NB-IoT in the US is just because it's such a process.
Yeah. I think the first test site was out in Vegas, just on T-Mobile, and it's been spreading, but not as much. And I think it's still just T-Mobile that's doing it.
Correct.
Over in Europe, it's I think there's more, like you said, right? There's more in Europe and Asia. They're trying it there because like longer term, it's like so low speed, and I think the costs were really low too. I remember seeing like I think Timo was doing like $5 or $10 for a whole year of data, and it was like a
Holy
pretty
moly.
decent amount. Yeah, so like this is always the restriction with cellular is that people have to pay for their data when they're used to like, hey, I have an ESP32, I can just hook it into Wi-Fi. It's like, well, yeah, you don't get that anymore. Sorry.
Nope, not at all.
Yeah, yeah. How about coverage? Have you gotten word? Well, I guess did your customers check if they have coverage everywhere? Because I have heard about spottiness, and even so the Cat M1 stuff.
Yeah, I mean it's been growing. So when I first kind of came out and like I was working on it in 2016 or 2017, 2018 ish, and it was still kind of new. And when I called them Verizon, people still had no idea what a Cat M1 device was, and you had to like get to the special technician to get it to.
You're like sending out the same PowerPoint to every customer service person you talk to.
You had to get to the specific person that knew what to do, so your sim could get activated. It was that bad.
Oh wow.
and
Okay.
and I was talking to the Verizon guy, the kind of FAE, and he was like, "Oh, it's been great. It's been like this for a while." I'm like, "I don't think so, dude. Like, that's not my experience."
Right, right. Well, probably because he was probably hearing it internally, like, "Yeah, it's coming," and it's like, well, if that's a lot different than like when you're talking to like a level one customer service person. It's like, well, they don't get it's got to work all the way down the chain to
Right.
every operating procedure that exists, and it's like if it doesn't make it that far, then it effectively doesn't exist to the public.
Exactly.
Well, yeah, it's I had I had one customer. I was doing like a remote monitoring project. It was really interesting. It was a Cat M1 modem on board, and the person deploying the system out in the field, they held up their phone. It was on AT&T. They held up their phone, four bars on AT&T. Right, they could see the tower, and then nothing would happen on the board that we were working on and they were trying to deploy. And it was like, so finally they called up AT&T and they're like, oh, you know what? Actually, we don't run that tower. And it's like because there's these third party operators that go under the banner of AT&T, but they don't have software control of the tower operator. So it was like this tower operator just didn't have the right software on it to do Cat M1, and like you said, is as easy as a switch, but
Right.
they hadn't flipped the switch yet. They hadn't upgraded their software, so that site was completely down. Like you just couldn't deploy in that area then.
Oh,
Yeah,
yeah. That's the story of Cat M1 these days, and I
yeah,
mean it's a lot better. I've been able to the cool thing with hologram is I've been able to sit in my office and it will seamlessly switch between Sprint and AT&T
uh huh. That's
without
nice.
me even thinking about it. So, I mean, if one goes down, then you have the other option, or it gives you options.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, that's great. So you had mentioned on this device you are doing Zephyr. Can you explain what Zephyr is?
Zephyr is a real time operating system, an RTOS, and it is a kind of a culmination of a lot of work from the folks at the Linux Foundation to create this. It's kind of like Linux for embedded. It's very similar. It takes a lot of configuration similarities from Linux and it brings it to the embedded world.
Uh
And
huh.
there's a lot of advantages around using it as an RTOS because I mean, as I mentioned, there's a lot of work that's been done already. You can load up things that's been pre-coded by people. It's just a giant repository of anything you can think of.
Yeah. Yeah, when you download the package, it's like now downloading every SDK from ST. Now downloading all the Nordic SDKs. It's like holy shit, this is like 20 gigabytes of stuff that is downloading just to because it just wants to have everything there. And it's
Yep.
yeah, it's not small. It definitely killed my last hard drive. It was like full after that.
Yeah. So that one of the thing about Nordic's SDKs is basically the Zephyr SDK, but they tune it and they remove items that are just not applicable. So they'll remove all the microchip and the ST and everything. They'll just
Oh, they will.
prune it
That's
out,
nice.
so it's much smaller. It's not that big of a deal compared to if you were to just use. They have a program called West that you use do all the management with,
Uh-huh.
and it's a little bit better.
Yeah. So I mean, did you have a lot of Linux experience previous to this?
Not at
Or was it
all.
kind of learning curve?
It was. I mean, I've been using Linux since I was a kid. Somehow or one or another, I had a game server in my house running
Oh,
on like
nice.
133 megahertz.
Yeah. Turbo button.
I don't know how I did it. I had like 8 slots in there. It was like a Counter Strike server. And then
Oh,
that's when I
nice.
kind of cut my teeth on Linux. I was like, oh, this is kind of cool.
Yeah.
And then somebody was able to like kind of hack into it somehow. I don't even know how they did
Okay.
it. Something with the Counter Strike server, they were able to get backdoor access.
Well, but so do you think people that are coming into the using Zephyr would that be tough for them if they're not Linux savvy?
If they're used to Linux development, they might be able to take to it like fish like water.
Uh-huh.
For other people, I kind of alluded to this when I originally started posting about it. It's like if you're coming from maybe Nordic's traditional SDK and you're going to Zephyr, it's gonna be a bit of a change.
Is
There's
it
a
okay?
different process flow. There's different tools. For instance, as you mentioned, like you need to download like a bunch of repositories. Well, they have West, but the tool called West for that, and West basically it's kind of like if you use Git submodules,
Uh-huh.
but not really. So you
Okay.
have this kind of definition file that basically says, here are all the repos that I want, and here are all the checksum or the hashes for those repos from that commit I want, and then it'll go and fetch them all in kind of it'll do a shallow clone versus doing like a full clone of a repo, or I think it goes down a few steps deeper, but it's not like a full clone of every single repo. That would be crazy.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. So it's just the stuff that the header files, whatever it needs, and everything else is kind of left to the user if they want to go get everything else or what?
It'll get everything for you, and it'll get all this like all the source files that are within those repositories that you've called out. If you want to tune it and you only want to include certain pieces of code in your project, that's where you would go in. They have a project file. So for people who have used Nordic's SDK previously, they had a SDK config.h.
Yeah.
Well, this project file is very similar to that concept where you're enabling or disabling certain parts of of libraries, or that's where everything gets turned on and off, and that's where you're either compiling it or not. Now, in
Yeah.
terms of not downloading more code, I don't think there's any way to do it other than removing the line for the Git repository from your project configuration.
You got it. And at that point, you're messing around with stuff that's already pre-configured. Usually, it's like you're starting from a pre-configured thing, anyways. I'm guessing if you're
Yeah,
using the Nordic platform, or if you're using like an ST thing that's already ready for it, you just use that dev board to start with, and then modify for your needs.
exactly. And you're when usually like Nordic, they give you everything. So all you have to do is just download it and start using it. And
Yeah.
other vendors probably do the same thing. But yeah, if you want to go off the rails a little bit, then you're kind of on your own. And I don't recommend that for people who are starting out. But
Yeah.
it's definitely doable.
Okay. Yeah, you have written a post about it that I actually really. So I should say I am based on this post, and also the and not XOR guys were talking about it recently, and then Ian, who's one of the guys on my forum, they were all kind of talking about Zephyr, and I started taking a bigger look at it. I was gonna do free RTOS instead, which I don't know is an option on the 9160, but it definitely is for the 50, NRF 52. And I was looking at it, looking at it. I've got a book on free RTOS, which is interesting just for learning RTOS in general. But like, it's it's it feels like this is kind of a new push in that new direction of like Zephyr's kind of got a lot of backing if you pick the right if you're within what the vendors are choosing it like ST and Nordic, then you are in a good spot. If you wanted to bring in like like a Renesas part, you might be kind of up a creek, but you can find some parts that are targeted Zephyr's targeted for.
Yeah, there's a huge library of boards that are available in Zephyr. If you go to like Zephyr boards in terms of the file structure,
Uh-huh.
they have like ARM and RISC and everything. You click down in the ARM and there's just like a list of different boards and like what. But you're exactly right. It really depends on the vendor if they've supported Zephyr. And I know Nordic has had support for Zephyr for a long, like unofficial support for Zephyr for a
Yeah,
long time.
right. Yep, yep. Huh. Okay. So and then you've written this post, the how to build drivers for Zephyr, and that does seem like it's kind of the hard thing because now you have an RTOS, which is a real-time operating system that's kind of like doing all the timing and all the task switching and all that other stuff. But now, much like Linux, you need to like write a driver. So what does that look like for people that are interested in doing that sort of thing? Specifically me, I'm really worried about me here, Jared.
You can do it. Number one, it's
Okay.
not that big of a deal, and it's too. You can go to whatever level you want to. For
Uh huh.
instance, you can kind of implement your driver code within your app if you really want to. That's kind of like the more traditional way. At least I've done it in the past. But Zephyr has a bunch of predetermined kind of structures for different type of drivers. So the article that I wrote was based around a real-time clock chip that I have on the NRF 91 Feather. And they don't exactly have an API that matches it 100%, but they did have I believe it was a timer API. So I
Uh huh.
went through and I kind of searched around. This is all like once I got comfortable with the SDK, I was like, all right, well, I got to figure out how to do this. So I
Yeah.
started searching through the SDK, and I was like, all right, if I have to use this structure, like, how do I initialize it? And what they do is you create this structure as a driver, and that driver, all the functions get pushed into a struct, like a struct constructors, like
Uh huh.
what's your init function, what's your write time function, what's your clear time function, and then what you do is you then access all those calls by using their, which I'm still trying to figure out 100%, but they have a whole, I think it's a Linux idea of of a device tree.
Uh huh. Yep.
So you look up a device by its name or by whatever you configure it as, and you pull it in, and then it becomes a kind of this generic device, and then you can call certain calls from that device, and that's what happens. It's like your driver, that struct kind of gets turned into something you can access through a device in your main code, and then you can swap out. Like for instance, if I wanted to use a different RTC, I don't have to go through and recode everything. I can go to the datasheet and I can create another driver using that same kind of structure, and then I can just start using it with my code, and then it's just a defined in my project file.
Yeah, yeah. That's the magic of Linux, right? That's how Linux and Windows as well, right? Like these higher level operating systems, they know that they need a certain function and that it's there, but then they don't really care what the hardware is underneath, which is pretty great if and when it all works out. So
Yeah, and that's the hard part.
that's the rub. Yeah.
That's the rub. It's like, hey, I mean, there's an API here, but we don't know what's going on underneath. So
So sometimes are you writing like the translation layer between what the API is from the vendor, or are you, like to translate between that vendor supplied API and the Zephyr stuff, or what is the hard part?
the hard part was trying to figure out what API I could use. Like I was looking through and like what looks the most. I had to have the search by text, so I'm like timer, like real time clock, like going through, and then I found that timer one, the one I'm using right now. I'm like, all right, this looks like it has. I would look at their API, so I'd look at the struct and see what calls they had, and if it was something that would match up, at least I can get functionality out of the chip. That's where I would. That's where I would go. So that layer that I'd write, it would include everything from like I2C initialization to actually kind of sending commands back and forth, and then that is all abstracted from your app. So you can just kind of use the API and just set a timer. You can read the timer, you can clear it, so on and so forth.
Yeah. Okay. So did you have to write the all the way down to the bottom like driver as well? Like so you were writing like register manipulation code kind of stuff, or like how low did you have to go for this?
Yeah, I was the low level, so I was reading the data sheet. And I was going, okay, what register do I need to change to get this thing to start a timer?
Got it. Okay. So you were handed like the thing of like init, right? So that's a very simple example of like, all right, I want to init a real time device of some type, and then during an init, then you'll go look at the data sheet and you're like, all right, I have to set the daytime, whatever the different registers are, and then that encapsulates the behavior that the init function is asking for. Is that right?
Yeah, and it really depends on the chip. So I don't think I have to do too crazy of a init procedure. But yeah, for some other chips, maybe you have a more complicated accelerometer gyro where you have to do a bunch of setup. Then yeah, that's where you would do it. And then as you use the device, then you can make these API calls which go down to the low layer, and then that's where all the magic happens in terms of stuff going over I2C or SPI or UART.
Yeah. So how are you testing that? So you're writing this code for the low level RTC. How are you testing it? Is it like a standalone test for just the code that you write, or how do you actually go and step through all that to make sure it's correct?
I think there are better ways of testing it, but right now I'm just doing functionality testing. So, I
Okay.
mean, it's not that crazy of a driver. It's just like it's a timer, like an external timer. So I'm just making sure that it's working, and I can change it and set it to different timer intervals, and it'll actually interrupt when I need it to.
Okay. So you're writing the full app and then using that with like breakpoints and whatever. Like you're just debugging the full app and that works okay.
Yeah, and yeah, that's basically what I've been doing. I've played a little bit with doing the debugging as effort is a little bit different from what I'm used to in the Nordic SDK, and that's also very possible. It gets more complicated when you have a bootloader. They decided to use MCU boot, which is good and bad because I didn't realize that I had issues debugging, and I removed the bootloader. I'm like, oh, it's working all of a sudden. So for anybody who's trying to debug on Zephyr, if they have MCU boot initialized, they might have to do some extra funny business to get it to work.
Okay. That's good to know. Well, that's great. I mean, this is I really do appreciate that you wrote this document on Memfault. I think it's going to be helpful for me, so I appreciate that. Thanks a lot.
You're welcome.
Let's talk a little bit about the other board that you built as well. So you are in the Feather form factor ecosystem. It seems like I saw you were also using some of the particle stuff, the Xenon, and but then you made a sensor board.
Correct. Yeah, so the sensor board is called the Air Quality Wing, and it's based on a few different sensors that I wanted to kind of put together for testing air quality. I was kind of concerned at the time with the air quality in my. I was at the time at my brother's house. We were renting a room from him, and he has baseboard heating. So whenever the baseboard heat would turn on, I'm like, I wonder how bad the air gets when this happens.
Yeah.
So between so I had a TVOC. It's a kind of a total organic volatile chemical compounds, and then also for the humidity, temperature, and also I had a particulate sensor made by Honeywell, all connected to this one board, and then I would hook it up to at the time a Xenon, and I would use that to broadcast it up to the cloud and then into an InfluxDB database. And I had a Grafana front end where I could see where all the variables were at the time. I could look back and see what the history was.
Uh-huh.
So what I found out was there's a lot of particles when you're cooking,
Okay.
and when you're heating up your house with a baseboard heat, there's a lot of dust that gets thrown into the air, a lot of particulates.
Uh-huh.
And those are the two big things that I've noticed so far using this device. And I've had mine on the wall just like running, and I actually hooked up a little piezo to it, so whenever it goes over a certain level, it starts beeping.
Yeah.
So and then you walk over to the air filter, the air purifier, and I just like turn it on max
Oh.
until it goes down again.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Gotta
I've been,
gotta
I've
hook
been
that thing in the
trained.
network next. You gotta get that thing to talk to the network and turn
Exactly.
itself on, right?
Yeah, I mean that's my next project, but once I have a lot to do before then.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it sounds like. I mean, I'm sure that a lot of people out, a lot of friends down on the West Coast are probably feeling this more than most with all the wildfires that are happening. I just keep seeing posts about, particulate counts are really up out there. Not that you would probably need a sensor when they're that high, but it's still,
Right.
yeah, it's a good thing to be thinking about. I think the VOC sensors, I use those on a project as well, and it was like I heard that they got really popular because of Hurricane Katrina. Apparently, that's like what drove a lot
Huh.
of the VOC sensor, boom that's happening right now. Because there was like some kind of like legislation that happened when they brought in these trailers that had like a bunch of formaldehyde in the walls or something like that, some VOC, volatile like organic compound, and it was
Yeah.
like that's what drove a lot of the sensors, and that's why it's easier to get them than it used to be.
I found that I've gotten the most insight from the particulate sensor, where it's actually shooting a laser and counting the particles.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
the T-Box sensor does kind of align with those results though, which is kind of cool to see. Like it's a little bit slower, but it follows the results. So as things go up in the room, it usually kind of follows right along, which is pretty
yeah,
neat.
yeah. Yeah, it is. It's interesting to kind of like pull trends out of like once you do graph it, it's like it's very visible and visceral at that point. You're like, oh, okay, it was real bad that day. That's why I felt like crap or whatever it was.
Right?
Yeah,
Exactly. It's like, why are my eyes itchy? And then you go and
yeah,
look at the graph. It's like, oh, all right, I got to turn on the air filter.
yeah. So let's talk. Let's just swing back to the NRF at 9160 there. Any other lessons learned before we get finished here? I mean, what else? What else have you been learning as you've been crowdfunding this thing and getting it out of the world?
Oh man, any other lessons learned?
I should say that you've been posting really great updates throughout. I've been following that, just seeing all the different things you've been going through. But like, yeah, are there any like unexpected things given your hardware experience?
The biggest thing is it takes a long time. Like by yourself, I've been
Yeah,
working on this thing for months now,
yeah,
and well, I'm at the end of the tunnel. It's just this compliance stuff, and then getting the boards built. That's kind of the biggest things, and then after that, it's like making sure the software is good enough to make sure everybody's happy when they're using these things. Uh, that's a whole other can of worms too. So
yeah, yeah. The first half takes 90%. The second half it takes 90% of your time. Whatever that saying is. Yeah,
that sounds about right. Yeah.
yeah. Or maybe it was the first 90% takes 90% of your time. The last 10% takes 90% of your time, or something like that. But yeah, it's
Yeah.
yeah, it can definitely be like and then you have all the customer support stuff you're gonna have to deal with as well because you've sold
Mm.
like a couple hundred of these things, right?
Yeah, there's a lot of boards going out into the world, and about
Yeah.
half of them are going outside the U.S. and half of them are in. So
Oh,
so the
cool.
shipping out of the U.S. thing is going to be interesting. Hopefully, nothing gets lost. I've had some stuff get
Yeah.
lost before, so it
Yeah.
won't be a surprise if something does.
Boy. Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, all right. So 9160 can work overseas as well.
Yeah, so for it's nearly a global module. So Nordic, that's what Nordic has been working on these past years. When we were like, oh, okay, they have the module, cool. Can't use it. Well, what they've been doing over the past year, if you go to their website, you can go check out their compatibility matrix for the different bands in different countries. You can also they also post, I believe it's on their compliant. If you search for Nordic Semiconductor and NRF 9160 compliance, should bring you to that page where they have all the cellular providers that they are certified or they work with, and also the compliance in terms of countries where the modem, the module is certified to work on particular bands in those countries. So if you're in a country and you want to use NRF91, I would definitely check that out just to make sure that it works
Yeah.
with a provider you have, and also that, uh, and if it works with a provider, it most likely is obviously certified in
Yeah.
terms of compliance.
Yeah. One thing that's good too is if you haven't ever done it, listeners, not you, I'm sure you know this, Jared, but if you go to opensignal.com/networks, you could see coverage for all the different carriers within your country, and that's some approximation of the coverage map as well. So that could be a helpful resource to make sure you're not buying something you can't use, just to cross reference it.
Yeah, if you, especially for Cat M1, that usually kind of aligns with cellular. Anything if you have a cell signal, most likely you're going to have M1. It might not be the same for NB-IoT, so that's something to remember too.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good point. Well, great. Well, Jared, thanks for joining us here. You said you might have a coupon code for people that are or a link to for the remaining boards. Is that right? A place to buy these
Yeah,
things.
so there are some NRF 9160s going to be available very soon. If you want to go to jaredwolff.com/amp hour, you can sign up and you'll get a 10% off coupon if you want to purchase the NRF 9160 feather. And that should be within the next couple weeks or so. I have some boards here right now, which is very exciting. So I'll be shipping out to backers, and then it'll be available for sale shortly after that.
Great. Great. Well, good luck and all that. I'm excited to see this stuff, and I appreciate, like I said, I appreciate you sharing what you're doing and showing it, showing your progress on your blog and elsewhere. It's been really useful.
Thanks, Chris.
All right. Talk to you soon.
All right, later.